All right, everyone, welcome back to week number 2 of ENVS 3100 Human Wildlife Interactions. This week, we are going to dive into the ecological elements of human wildlife conflict and human wildlife interactions. Now, as a caveat, before we begin this week's content, this is going to be a pretty high level overview. We could, definitely have a course almost solely devoted to this side of the spectrum. So forgive me if it doesn't go into the extreme depth that you're seeking. Again, you can always join office hours to ask more questions, but there is an expansive amount of literature far beyond what I provide for the course module this week that you can dive into these topics. But let's get into it. So we talked about this a little bit in week 1, some of the most common types of human wildlife conflict, right? But what brings wildlife into conflict with humans, right? And so there's some predominant causes that can be typically associated. We have habitat loss, resource competition, climate change is a big one, pollution, invasive species, recreational activities, urban expansion, agricultural development under habitat loss, water scarcity and food shortages under resource competition, temperature changes, weather extremes that alter the behavior of wildlife related to climate change, industrial waste and pesticides that might result in negative impacts for the wildlife, but also cause changes in their behavior, non-native species disruptions, things like that in invasive species, and then folks are out in nature, right? And so coming into contact with, an example of bears on a hiking trail or something like that. These are all some of the predominant ecological causes. Recreational activities, it's more social ecological. We're out, in nature. We're altering nature, altering wild spaces. So you might argue with me a little bit, but there is, as you can see, social dimensions of this, right? Human activity. So purely ecological, we're talking about species requirements, species behavior, nutritional needs, habitats, things like that, which I'll dive into with some specific case studies that'll go a little bit more in depth. But sort of this is how you can think of the framing and sort of position your ideas you're thinking about where we're at this week. So habitat loss and fragmentation is going to be one of the biggest, one of the most significant causes of human wildlife conflict. And you can think about habitat loss and fragmentation not only as clear cutting forest, wiping species habitat out, but also a slow cookie cutting, cut reduction in size, but also division of contiguous forest or continuous wildlife habitat. So we see this a lot in the Amazon rainforest currently, where you have this sort of gradual clearing of forest for livestock grazing land, which brings humans into contact with jaguars, primates, many other species, resulting in more conflict as these human communities settle in these lands, but also as these wildlife like jaguar, these animals like jaguar take down livestock and cause losses for ranchers in this region. So, cutting into habitat, cutting into species habitat, limiting movement, movement pathways is going to ultimately drive more human wildlife conflict in the long run. We also have resource competition, which again is can sometimes be a little bit weird to think about, right? Because there's not an inherent competition of wildlife, trying to steal resources from humans. But in regions of Africa specifically, where food insecurity is such a serious issue, and I would say like across the globe for smallholders in general, especially subsistence farmers who are farming to feed their families, competing over the resources that they're seeking to sell their crops, and the wildlife that may not have sufficient resources in their own habitat that are also seeking out food and substances to meet their energetic needs. This creates a situation of competition, right? And in areas where drought is very common, and water is very scarce, there can be serious issues where wildlife is competing with humans to access that water, and in many cases can pollute the water with dung, disease, or deplete it completely, right? So you do see this idea of resource competition, but it's a little bit more complex and nuanced than maybe what you think about in terms of like, well, you have farmers competing for a very limited amount of water resources to water their crops. But it is an interesting way to frame it, that I think puts both humans and wildlife on a kind of understandable level playing field. And when we see this loss taking place, which doesn't put it too much on the anthropocentric side, or villainize wildlife too much, right? Climate change is a big one, as we mentioned. The Arctic is a really good example of polar bears losing habitat due to decreasing sea ice and moving into human-dominated landscapes and cities and towns, and very serious consequences, polar bear attacks and polar bear killing and extermination and relocation as a result. But climate change is more and more changing the behavior, changing, altering the habitat that wildlife call home. That's resulting in uncommon behavior, but also in maybe more desperate behavior to seek resources that exacerbates this issue. An example I can share from my research is last year during really extreme heat wave in Thailand and drought, we had very rare sun bears, which are very rarely spotted in this region that I work in, coming into human settlement and seeking out resources because the forests were just completely dry and depleted. The food resources, the water resources were depleted, and so they were coming into human settlements and getting into trash and actually going into people's beehives, beekeepers' beehives, and stealing honey. So you can see this happen. And again, do you see some overlap here? We see like habitat degradation, loss, fragmentation, resource competition, climate change. I'm already kind of setting you up to see how these things are all interconnected and can compound and exacerbate each other. But climate change can lead to these ecological causes for sure. Human encroachment goes hand in hand with habitat loss and fragmentation. But you see folks wanting to live more in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, to live closer to nature. And so naturally, you are going to come into contact with more wildlife that call those spaces home. And so you see more ecological causes of conflict as wildlife seek out the food sources and move around in their habitats as they naturally would, but now have this sort of new settlement or folks living in these areas more and more prevalently. So you see this a lot. Decreased prey availability is quite a large one. Overhunting, climate change, loss of habitat, right? When carnivores are losing the ungulates or different prey species that they rely on, they're gonna seek out food sources in other areas. And in some agricultural spaces, cattle, pigs are easier prey to take down than a deer or another wild species, right? They're contained. They might be a bit easier to catch, domesticated. And so for some carnivores, these prey availability options are much more tantalizing than the energy required and the risk required to catch this prey in their natural habitat. But also, these stocks of wildlife may be depleted, and so you may see this more often. But this is a very serious one, and one that is often heavily studied and considered in ecology and biology in terms of addressing human-wildlife conflicts in those disciplines. Pollution and outdoor activity, again, is a little bit more, is it like, ecological cause? Social ecological, right? But as landscapes become more polluted, or we see some maybe good intentions but overlap within these wild spaces, we can see conflict increase. Again, this can be more on the ecological impacts of conflict, right? The more impacts that are felt stronger by wildlife in some cases. But yeah, I don't want to go too far into these, but you can think about these pretty naturally as sources of conflict and issue. So species traits is going to be a big one that is going to be a driver of conflict, right? So as different species behave differently, have different requirements, live and are biologically different, prefer different habitats, some may be more prone to conflict than others, right? And so dietary habits, right? Species that are omnivores, bears, are going to be more inclined to easily adapt to human spaces and eat human foods. Coyotes, these species can more easily adapt to human spaces and thrive in these environments, leading to more conflict. Habitat requirements, animals that require large territories or very specific habitats can be more conflict prone, like elephants or tigers that need, large movement, large ranges can cause them to come into contact with more humans as they move about their natural habitat or, encroach into human dominated spaces. But again, these boundaries can be quite porous, quite poorly defined. Again, wildlife are typically not, they're not thinking, oh, I'm crossing over, this fence. I shouldn't do that, right? Like it's just all habitat for them in many cases. Species that are naturally curious or bold, such as, primates, coyotes, male elephants and musk, lions, they may come into contact with human settlement more frequently. Especially the example of male elephants and musk, which is their breeding season, which makes them more aggressive. This is where you really see an intensification as they need resource requirements. They need to be moving about, looking for mates, but also can be highly aggressive to any sort of perceived threat. And so that can really result in more conflict. Reproductive rate, animals with high reproductive rates, like we were talking about rabbits in the first week's module, they can populate quite quickly, which can lead to those, higher results of property damage, subsistence loss, garden loss, crop loss, these sort of things. And especially if these populations get out of control, very serious conflict outcomes can be the result. And migration patterns, right? Like birds that need to migrate to different areas in large numbers, especially with conflict on the open ocean and coastal environments. But also, habitat connectivity, migratory routes that have been subjected to fragmentation. We can see more ecological consequences and ecological causes of conflict in these situations. So when you're thinking about human wildlife conflict and you're studying it from an ecological perspective, these are some things to consider, right? The size and the strength of the wildlife, right? When you're thinking about solutions, like a fence, if you build a very small, short, weak fence, it could probably be very easily knocked over by many species. So you have to think about this. How do wildlife behave? What are their requirements? Things like that. The IUCN status, are they endangered, vulnerable, threatened? This may really guide policy, it will guide policy, and should guide your thinking on how you address any sort of solution. Intelligence is really important, right? And we are learning more and more about different species intelligence every day. But thinking about how intelligent a species is really determines how long a solution may last, right? If the species that you're working with is highly intelligent, then they might adaptability is right next to it quite quickly to any solution you deploy. So you have to remain adaptive on your side as well to mitigate that and to accommodate that, to ensure that your solution continues to work, right? But there's really incredible work being done with human elephant conflict to really try to better understand the intelligence, behavioral flexibility, risk-taking behavior of elephants. Josh Plotnick at City University of New York in his lab does a lot of work on this. And maybe we could cater mitigation solutions or conservation efforts to the specific intelligence or behavioral traits of a habitual crop raider, an elephant that behaviorally damages crops a lot, right? So a lot of really interesting work being done in that space, and a really, really interesting and important area to focus on. Disease, like chronic wasting disease with deer and ungulate species is a very serious issue in Colorado. But how serious is it? Do we need to think about the mitigation solutions to prevent spread or exacerbation of the issue, right? And how risky could the species be to spreading disease to human populations, right? So very important. Occupancy, how does this species utilize the landscape? Where are they most prevalent? Where are they most concentrated? How are they moving about the landscape? Where is the resources they use or prefer? Vegetation, prey, water. How many is going to be related to abundance, and occupancy and abundance are quite correlated and connected within ecology. But how are the species using the landscape? How many of them are there? And that really, really is very critical to mitigation that is tailored towards species to ensure that you're putting it in the right place, that it's going to work, that it's actually going to achieve the goals and aims that you're looking for, right? This understanding at the ecological basis is very critical. Sex variations, right? Differences between male and female species and their behavior is incredibly important to consider. Like I mentioned, that example of male Asian elephants being more dangerous when they're in must. Different sexes of species behave differently. Mothers, let's say female grizzly bears may be more aggressive or protective of their offspring and maybe ranging in different areas and more resource dependent. And so we need to think about that. Again, looking at occupancy and abundancy and composition of the habitat that we're looking to protect. This is another key variable. And then habituation, right? I talked about this already, but this is the behavioral trait of a species to adapt, become more risk prone, become more comfortable, to learn, and to continually go into a space that typically a wildlife or an animal species would not enter, like crop raiding, right? Like it's not, a very natural, suitable, sustainable habitat for many elephants to be in these crop fields, but learning and habituating that I can go in here to get the resources I need quickly and often creates this habitual behavior, this continued behavior. And then for some species, they become habituated crop raiders, where they become like a problem species, or habituated to taking down livestock, to where that's their preferred method of resource capture, resource acquisition. And so it becomes a very serious issue that has to be considered and difficult. And you have to think about, if I'm going to deploy a solution that an animal could habituate to, how do we plan for that in advance, right? To mitigate a solution where you've invested a lot of time and money into a solution that now wildlife have learned to adapt to and get around, and now you don't have any more budget to change it or improve it, right? So we're going to talk in future modules about thinking about this adaptability and sustainability of any solution. And so when I talk about, habituation, size, intelligence, with elephants, the examples are often habitual fence breakers. And across both continents, Asian elephants and African elephants have deftly learned how to overcome electric fencing. So you can see this elephant here, this Asian elephant is very carefully moving the wooden post of this electric fence so as not to be electrocuted, very carefully laying that post down, pushing it down, and is now going to enter into that cropland. And this is learned behavior, right? Learning that the wires are electric, but the wood doesn't conduct the electricity. And so if I just use, even though I'm very large and I could just push it over with my body weight, I can use my very deft or my very capable trunk to grab it and pull it over, right? And with African elephants, you see similar behaviors, but different adaptation, right? This elephant is using his tusks, which don't, he or she, it could be a male or female in Africa with tusks, but they don't conduct electricity, right? And so this elephant is using the tusks to pull down the electric fence to where it's compromised, and then just using brute strength, size, and force to overcome the barrier and to enter the space. And so, if you've just invested $1 million in this solution, and this is just done in minutes, right? This is very difficult, a very difficult challenge to overcome, especially with highly intelligent, adaptable, large species. So research and practice, right? Conservation and biodiversity, bringing in these maybe thought of as hard sciences or classical environmental sciences is crucial, right? Bringing in this knowledge is crucial to mitigating conflicts and preserving biodiversity. It is incredibly important to balance wildlife and human needs and human-wildlife conflict, but understanding wildlife, their behavior, species traits, their requirements is critical to deploying strategies, programs, habitat modification improvements that are going to benefit wildlife, but also, alter their behavior or provide them with an alternative that's going to prevent conflict. So habitat corridors are a great example, connecting fragmented areas together to facilitate wildlife movement that will not bring humans and wildlife into conflict, like wildland overpasses on roads, designating a specific corridor for wide-ranging species to pass through that might be fenced so that the wildlife can't get into the human-dominated spaces, the humans aren't crossing over. So like a kind of like a highway for wildlife to move between fragmented areas of forest. Crop protection like guarding, bees, we'll talk a little bit more about bees, but other species, smelly deterrents, lights, things like this that are specifically tailored to behavioral responses for specific wildlife. You can play predator calls that might be heard by a certain species and scare them from coming into an area. Some species might be more photosensitive or light sensitive, and so using spotlights or reflectors could work. Poor smells could be detected by some species that are highly reliant on olfactory systems, and also loud noises, right, frighten different species. So thinking about how different wildlife behave to different stimuli can really improve the solutions we put in place, and in many cases create really effective solutions that are nonviolent. But also really critically, I'm going to mention a lot in this course is community engagement, right? Being sure that the community is bought into this, is a part of this science, equally understands the ecology and biology we're thinking about, but also gathering information, local ecological knowledge from these communities is critical, right? They are the folks who have been, in many cases, sharing landscapes and experiencing this conflict for many generations, hundreds of years in some cases, for some new, which might give us new insights, right? It could be a new phenomenon that they've watched, come up. We need to listen to these communities, take in their local ecological knowledge to apply to our solutions and ideas. This will only improve any solution that we deploy. And again, we'll talk about this more as we go throughout the semester, but any sort of ecological strategy, a fence or habitat modification, this needs to be acceptable to local communities to be successful. Population ecology, another key component, focusing on how populations of wildlife species interact with their environment, how their size, birth rates, and mortalities might change over time. We can think about this in terms of control and maintenance of wildlife populations. So you can sterilize different wildlife populations to keep them from reproducing. You can think about different birth rates and seasons and seasonality of conflicts. Looking at mortality rate, especially with retaliatory killings, can be a clear indicator of the level of tolerance. One of the most classically used indicators, ecological indicators of tolerance, but also of conflict intensity and severity. How different species migrate might very seriously affect different livelihoods like cropping and fishing. And then prey-predator interactions. So thinking about landscapes of fear is an ecological theory that has been used in human-wildlife conflict mitigation about how prey and predators navigate a landscape, and how we might be able to utilize or leverage these predator-prey dynamics to modify landscapes or set up solutions or alter species behavior that results in less conflict. So this is interesting population ecology and behavioral ecology ideas. I realize I do have some behavioral ecology mixing in with the population ecology. I'm not a hard ecologist, not a classical ecologist, so forgive me if I'm double dipping here or overcrossing topics. Spatial and geographic studies, geographical information systems, GIS, incredibly crucial to managing and understanding human-wildlife conflicts, right? Creating maps, looking at satellite imagery, looking at habitat composition, tracking movement patterns by collaring wildlife to see how they're moving along the landscape. Incredibly crucial, highly specific and technological skills, highly valuable in the field. GIS and mapping is going to be used in almost any sort of really good human-wildlife conflict strategy. So definitely think about that. There's an example I believe I provide to you in this week's module, but looking at a case study of conflict resolution in Yellowstone, where maps are used to get data on wildlife movements, see how habitat has been fragmented over time that may influence populations and behavior. looking at where the buffer zones, the sort of middle between zones where conflict can be the most intense between human and wild settlements is most pronounced, where we can focus solutions, and then going in and making those modifications to those spaces. So lots more there. If you want to discuss more, let me know. But really, really fascinating topic, especially if you're really technical savvy, interested in satellite imagery and remote sensing and advances in AI and technology. GIS will only continue to become more and more important. So a great career path to think about as well. Species-specific dynamics, another case study of human coyote conflicts in suburban areas. So this study focused on major metropolitan areas to understand the behavior and specific movement patterns of coyotes. So they used camera traps, which we'll talk about as like a remote triggered camera, to study how coyotes moved, behaved, utilized their landscape to better understand the species as a whole. And they determined patterns of activity, foraging, denning, movement, and also looked at genetic sampling and prey composition through scat, through their dung, to analyze the dietary preferences, to see how they could improve coyote habitat, but also create better deterrence and potentially modify human landscapes to keep humans and coyotes safe. Emily Beam, who was a PhD student in ENVS, worked on a study related to this. Really interesting and really important on the Front Range. There's a very famous video or image of a coyote riding the MRT or the bus or something like that. Yeah, so very common and very serious issue that we have to address because retaliatory killing of coyotes, we could impact local coyote populations, disease spread, but also attacks to pets and dogs. This is a serious issue in urban environments that has to be addressed. So in the space of ecology with human-wildlife conflicts, future study needs and directions, we need to look, as I just mentioned, more at the idea of urbanization and wildlife interaction. So investigating the effects of rapid urbanization, changes in urbanization, on wildlife behavior and habitat loss, right? These areas have not always been urban. Many of them overlap extensively with wildlife. And in some cases, urban environments have existed for so long, wildlife have moved in and adapted and made these places part of their habitat. So we have to think about this and constantly be adapting and evaluating. As climate change intensifies, we need to better understand wildlife migration patterns, breeding cycles, and habitat suitability under changing environmental circumstances and extreme weather patterns and climate patterns. As I mentioned, technology and monitoring will only begin to increase and get more and more important. Now we have AI being used to help in identifying individual wildlife, naming and assigning individual IDs to species like tigers based on their stripe patterns, which could then help us identify habitual livestock predators or livestock tigers that take livestock, sorry, but also tigers that have been more historically prone to human attack and things of those cases. Camera traps continue to improve, remote sensing. So there's a huge potential for technology and monitoring to continue to advance. We have groups like Wild Labs at WWF that just focus on this, right? Bioacoustic monitoring, picking up audio, analyzing that, drones, these ideas. So a ton of really, really interesting, amazing work that can be done in that space. Conservation strategies, bridging this ecological, biological data with conservation protection methods, incorporating it more into the way we deploy conservation and human-wildlife conflict mitigation continues to evolve every day. Long-term monitoring, a lot of studies and a lot of challenges is, like I mentioned, species behavior changes, circumstances change, wildlife and humans change and adapt. Some things that worked today might not work tomorrow. And we don't have a lot of studies that are long-term and collect really long longitudinal data to see how this sort of change occurs over time or the solution is impactful over time. And so we need more of this sustained science, sustained work, which requires better funding, better infrastructure, better support. And so long-term monitoring is very, very important and continues to be very important. And then conflict modeling and prediction, right? It's very interesting that a lot of these species behaviors, occupancy data, abundance data, movement data can be put into predictive modeling, like agent-based modeling, habitat suitability modeling, and even specific models that have been made to sort of mimic the way farmers or ranchers operate and the numbers of their cattle grow and decrease, and then the movement patterns of wolves or tigers to see how they may run out of prey within an agent-based model and now need to dip into or be more inclined to dip into livestock populations. So a ton of modeling opportunities related to computer sciences, statistics, combining ecological data and geographical data that we're only beginning to scratch the surface on. So that is all for the ecological aspects of human-wildlife interactions. Again, always feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You can check the course module for this week's assignments. And as always, thanks a lot. I appreciate your engagement, and we will talk soon.